At Jasenovac, killing became a sport. At Mauthausen, prisoners died on the stairs of death, and at Belzec, 600,000 lives were erased, with only 2 left to tell the tale. These weren't just death camps, they were factories of human destruction, and now I'm going to show you why. Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest and most notorious of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, operating from 1940 to 1945 near Oświęcim in Nazi-occupied Poland. Historians estimate that approximately 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, with around 90% being Jews. What made this place truly worse than death was the infamous selection process, that terrifying moment upon arrival when SS doctors like Josef Mengele would point left or right, determining with a casual gesture who would die immediately and who would endure prolonged suffering. The camp's 4 gas chambers and crematoria could process 6,000 to 12,000 people per day during peak operations. For those spared immediate death, life became a nightmare of starvation with less than 300 calories daily, 12 14-hour forced labor shifts, and constant brutality. The psychological torture of never knowing if they would survive another selection made existence itself a form of prolonged agony that many survivors described as worse than a quick death. But even Auschwitz's industrial scale of murder pales in comparison to camps designed for complete obliteration of memory itself. Belzec. Belzec operated from March 1942 to June 1943 as one of the 3 Operation Reinhard extermination camps. What made this place uniquely horrific was its singular purpose: rapid annihilation with almost complete erasure from history. Of the estimated 434,508 to 600,000 people murdered at Belzec, only 2 confirmed survivors emerged: Rudolf Raeder and Chaim Hirschman. Victims were murdered using carbon monoxide gas produced by large engines, dying within 20-30 minutes in chambers disguised as shower rooms. The killing process was so efficient that entire transports were dead within hours of arrival. Bodies were initially buried in vast pits, then later exhumed and burned on open-air pyres, with bone fragments ground into ash. The psychological torture began with deception. Families were told they were being resettled, maintaining hope until entering the gas chambers. This near-total obliteration of victims and witnesses made Belzec worse than death through the additional cruelty of historical amnesia, where suffering was compounded by being forgotten. While Belzec hid its crimes through erasure, Treblinka perfected the art of deceptive efficiency. Treblinka. Treblinka, the Secu, operated from July 1942 to October 1943, the death factory, through unprecedented efficiency in mass murder. With an estimated 700,000 to 900,000 victims killed in just 15 months, it became the 2nd deadliest camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka had no significant labor component. Its sole function was to kill as quickly as possible. The facility could kill up to 15,000, 20,000 people per day at its peak. Most arrivals were murdered within hours, using carbon monoxide from tank engines in gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. The camp was designed as a fake transit station, complete with painted signs promising showers and disinfection. This cruel deception maintained order until victims realized the horrifying truth. From July to September 1942 alone, over 265,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were murdered. The few Sonderkommando prisoners kept alive to maintain operations faced the unbearable psychological torture of being forced to participate in genociding their own people. Moving from mechanized killing to primitive brutality, we encounter a camp where murder became personal and sadistic. Jasenovac. Jasenovac operated from 1941 to 1945 in the independent state of Croatia, becoming synonymous with sadistic cruelty. With an estimated 83,000 to 100,000 deaths, including Serbs, Jews, Roma, and Croatian dissidents, what made Jasenovac worse than death was its primitive, hands-on brutality. Unlike mechanized killing at other camps, Jasenovac's murders were carried out with crude weapons like the infamous Srbosjek, Serb cutter, a glove with an attached curved blade used to slit throats. Guards used knives, axes, hammers, and mallets to bludgeon or dismember victims. Some were thrown alive into the Sava River or burned in makeshift crematoria. Survivor accounts describe horrific acts like prisoners being disemboweled, having eyes gouged out, or being forced to watch family members tortured. The hands-on brutality fostered a culture of sadism where guards took pleasure in inflicting pain. This personal, intimate violence created psychological trauma that survivors described as more torturous than death, as it stripped away all human dignity through direct physical cruelty. From the Balkans' primitive cruelty, we descend into the underground hell where prisoners never saw daylight. Mittelbau-Dora. Mittelbau-Dora was established in August 1943 near Nordhausen, Germany, primarily to produce V-2 rockets in underground tunnels of the Kohnstein Hill. Approximately 60,000 prisoners worked in these subterranean conditions, with an estimated 20,000 deaths from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and execution. What made this place worse than death was the underground environment itself. Prisoners worked in vast tunnels, with no natural light or ventilation, surrounded by constant dust from rock excavation that caused rampant respiratory diseases like silicosis. They received under 800 calories per day while performing 12-hour shifts of heavy manual labor, causing rapid physical deterioration. The psychological weight of producing weapons that killed Allied civilians added moral anguish for some prisoners. During the camp's evacuation in April 1945, over 9,000 prisoners were loaded onto ships like the Cap Arcona, which were bombed by the RAF, killing around 7,000. Survivors described the underground factory as a living hell, where prisoners worked in near darkness, breathing dust that choked you like a vice, making death seem like a release from endless suffering. Emerging from the suffocating tunnels, we find a camp where the very silence became a weapon of terror. Sobibor. Sobibor operated from May 1942 to October 1943 as part of Operation Reinhard, designed solely for mass murder. Between 200,000 and 300,000 Jews were killed there, with fewer than 60 known survivors. Its remote location in eastern Poland's forests, surrounded by swamps, earned it the moniker the Silent Death Camp. What made Sobibor worse than death was its complete isolation and the deceptive calm that masked systematic murder. Victims arrived by train and were immediately stripped of possessions, then herded into gas chambers disguised as showers within hours. Carbon monoxide piped from engines killed them within minutes, but the psychological terror of realizing the truth just before death was devastating. The selection process was deliberately chaotic and disorienting, tearing families apart without explanation. Approximately 70–80% of new arrivals were sent directly to gas chambers, never even being registered as prisoners. The famous October 14, 1943 uprising, led by Alexander Pachersky, saw around 300 prisoners escape, but most were later recaptured and killed. The camp's destruction afterward further silenced its history, adding the cruelty of erasure to the already unbearable suffering. Beyond the silent forests lay a camp where contradictions became instruments of psychological torture. Majdanek. Majdanek operated from 1941 to 1944 near Lublin, Poland, serving simultaneously as a concentration, forced labor, and extermination camp. An estimated 78,000 to 110,000 prisoners died there, including Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, and others. Its proximity to Lublin made it visible to locals, adding a layer of public complicity to prisoner suffering. What made Majdanek worse than death was its contradictory nature. Prisoners were simultaneously exploited for labor and systematically killed, creating constant uncertainty. They worked 12 to 14-hour shifts while receiving only 1,000 calories daily, insufficient for survival. The infamous Harvest Festival, Action Erntefest, on November 3 to 4, 1943, saw approximately 18,000 Jews shot in a single day. Living conditions were deliberately degrading, overcrowded, unheated barracks without sanitation, causing typhus epidemics. Gas chambers using Zyklon B and carbon monoxide operated alongside crematoria that burned continuously. The psychological torment of witnessing daily executions while being forced to maintain camp operations, combined with the arbitrary nature of selections, created an environment where survival felt like a punishment rather than salvation. From the camp of contradictions, we climbed to mountain fortresses where geography itself became an executioner. Mauthausen. Mauthausen was established in August 1938 near Linz, Austria, primarily for forced labor in granite quarries. Approximately 190,000 to 200,000 prisoners were held there, with 90,000 to 120,000 deaths. The SS nicknamed it Knochenmühle, bone grinder, due to its brutal conditions and high mortality rates. The notorious Stairs of Death, 186 uneven, slippery steps leading from the Wiener Graben quarry, became a symbol of the camp's cruelty. Prisoners were forced to carry granite blocks weighing 50 kilos up these stairs 8 to 10 times daily, working 9 to 11 hours regardless of weather in wooden-soled sandals. Guards would push prisoners to fall, causing deadly domino effects as stones crushed those below. SS guards sometimes forced prisoners to choose between being shot or pushing the prisoner in front of them off the parachutist's wall cliff. Suicides by jumping were frequent. Survivor Anthony Faramis described conditions surpassing Buchenwald's horrors, with rotten bodies littering the blocks and the sour stench of death making life itself a prolonged prolonged torture worse than immediate death. Leaving the granite quarries behind, we enter the realm of experimental killing methods. Chełmno. Chełmno operated from December 1941 to January 1945 in occupied Poland, marking the beginning of systematic Nazi genocide. An estimated 150,000 to 200,000 Jews, along with Roma and Soviet POWs, were murdered there. As the first extermination camp, it pioneered the use of mobile gas vans for mass murder. What made Chełmno worse than death was the cruel deception and agonizing method of killing. Victims were told they were being resettled or transported for work, then packed into airtight vans where exhaust fumes caused slow, terrifying deaths over 10 to 30 minutes. The victims' screams and desperate pounding from inside the vans indicated their full awareness of their fate, adding psychological torture to physical suffering. Jewish Sonderkommando prisoners were forced to remove bodies and bury them in mass graves, living with unbearable guilt, while knowing they too would be killed to eliminate witnesses. The camp's isolation in a small village, with only about 120 SS personnel, ensured secrecy while victims faced death with no hope of rescue. This combination of deception, prolonged agony, and forced complicity in their own people's murder created suffering that survivors described as transcending death itself. From mobile death vans, we move to a camp that served as blueprints for systematic cruelty. Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was established in 1936 near Berlin as one of the first purpose-built concentration camps, serving as a blueprint for other Nazi camps. Over 200,000 prisoners passed through, with 30,000 to 50,000 deaths from executions, starvation, disease, and exhaustion from forced labor. What made Sachsenhausen worse than death was its role as a training ground for SS cruelty and its proximity to Berlin, making it a showcase for Nazi propaganda. The systematic nature of creating maximum suffering before death made survival feel like prolonged punishment rather than salvation. Beyond the prototype camps lay facilities designed specifically to break the spirits of women. Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück operated from May 1939 to April 1945 as the only major Nazi concentration camp primarily designed for women, located north of Berlin. Approximately 130,000 to 132,000 individuals were imprisoned there, with death estimates ranging from 30,000 to 90,000. What made Ravensbrück worse than death was the specific targeting of women and the horrific medical experiments conducted there. SS doctors performed experiments on 74 Polish women known as the Ravensbrück rabbits, testing bone transplants, muscle grafts, and sulfonamide drugs. Many victims were maimed or died from these procedures conducted without anesthesia. Women faced forced labor for companies like Siemens, working 12-hour shifts with minimal sustenance. Prisoners were housed in overcrowded, unsanitary barracks with minimal bedding, suffering from malnutrition with daily rations as low as 200 grams of bread and thin soup. The targeting of mothers, daughters, and sisters, combined with sexual violence and the specific cruelties designed for women, created gender-specific suffering that survivors described as uniquely torturous. The camp's gas chamber, installed in early 1945, killed thousands in the final months, but the prolonged degradation beforehand made death seem merciful. From the targeting of women, we venture to the harsh Baltic shores where environmental brutality met systematic murder. Stutthof. Stutthof operated from September 1939 to May 1945 near Gdansk, Poland, becoming the first Nazi concentration camp outside Germany's pre-war borders and the last to be liberated. Of approximately 110,000 to 115,000 prisoners, about 65,000 died, a mortality rate exceeding 50%. What made Stutthof worse than death was its location in marshy, wooded Baltic terrain that exacerbated health issues. Typhus epidemics swept through in winters of 1942 and 1944, with December 1944 typhus deaths reaching 9% of the camp population. Prisoners faced severe overcrowding, with wet, lime-deficient terrain and inadequate shelter exposing them to harsh Baltic winters. Survivor Josef Salomonovich, who endured 8 camps including Auschwitz, called Stutthof the worst due to its relentless brutality. Execution methods included lethal phenol injections, drowning in mud, and beatings. As Soviet forces approached, death marches in brutal winter conditions killed thousands more, with approximately 5,000 prisoners forced into the Baltic Sea and shot. The combination of environmental harshness, disease, and sadistic cruelty created suffering that transcended death itself. Moving inland from the Baltic death trap, we encounter quarries that became symbols of destruction through labor. Gross Rosen. Gross-Rosen was established in August 1940 in Lower Silesia, initially as a satellite of Sachsenhausen, before becoming independent in May 1941. Approximately 89,964 to 100,000 prisoners passed through, with around 30,000 deaths from malnutrition, overwork, executions, and death marches. The granite quarries were the camp's original and most deadly work site, where prisoners faced extraordinarily harsh conditions. They worked 12-hour shifts extracting granite blocks for Nazi construction projects, hauling heavy stones without adequate tools or protective equipment. The quarry's dangerous environment caused frequent injuries and deaths from falling rocks and unstable terrain. Prisoners received meager rations of watery soup, 150 grams of bread, and thin vegetable broth, insufficient for the grueling labor. The camp was designated for incorrigible enemies of the Reich, with the classification return not desired, meaning prisoners weren't expected to survive. The policy of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through work, was evident as Nazis deliberately worked prisoners to death. Survivor Siegfried Halbreich described the constant harassment and mistreatment, making survival feel like prolonged torment worse than death. From stone quarries, we descend into the lawless realm where individual sadism knew no bounds. Płaszów. Płaszów operated from late 1942 to January 1945 near Krakow, Poland, built on former Jewish cemeteries. Up to 25,000 prisoners were held at its peak, with estimates of 30,000 to 150,000 passing through and 5,000 to 8,000 deaths within the camp. What made Płaszów worse than death was the sadistic rule of Commandant Amon Goeth, known as the Butcher of Płaszów. Goeth was notorious for shooting prisoners from his villa balcony, for no reason, often before breakfast as a perverse ritual. Survivor Poldek Pfefferberg recalled, "When you saw Goeth, you saw death." Mass executions occurred at Hujowa Gorka, where approximately 8,000 prisoners were killed and left in mass graves. Prisoners faced overcrowding with barracks meant for small groups housing 150 people, starvation, and arbitrary violence. Goeth ignored SS regulations, administering severe beatings or executions for minor infractions. The unpredictability of violence created pervasive terror, where survival meant enduring constant fear of random death, making existence itself a form of torture that prisoners described as worse than a swift end. Leaving behind individual brutality, we ascend to a mountain camp where isolation amplified every form of suffering. Natzweiler Struthof. Natzweiler Struthof operated from May 1941 to September 1944 in the Vosges Mountains of Alsace at 800 meters elevation. Of its 52,000 prisoners, 22,000 died from starvation, forced labor, medical experiments, and executions. What made this place worse than death was its remote mountain location that amplified suffering. The high altitude brought bitter cold, with inadequately clothed prisoners forced to climb treacherous stairs daily while performing grueling labor. Survivor Christian Ottoson described inmates lifting their legs with their hands to ascend, too weak to move naturally. The camp conducted horrific medical experiments, including the murder of 86 Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz who were gassed by SS Dr. August Hirt to create a skeleton collection for Strasbourg University. Gas chambers were constructed in a converted hotel building, primarily for experiments rather than mass extermination. The combination of environmental harshness, pseudoscientific torture, and complete isolation made survival an agonizing ordeal that transcended mere physical death, destroying prisoners' humanity before their bodies finally succumbed. From the mountains, we return to the forests where prolonged degradation became an art form. Buchenwald. Buchenwald operated from 1937 to 1945 near Weimar, Germany, holding approximately 280,000 prisoners over its existence. An estimated 56,000 perished from starvation, disease, medical experiments, executions, and exhaustion from slave labor. What made Buchenwald worse than death was its systematic degradation of human life through prolonged suffering. Prisoners received meager rations of watery soup and small bread portions, causing starvation so severe it reduced them to primal instincts. Nazi doctors conducted horrific experiments, including testing vaccines for typhus and poisoning effects on prisoners without anesthesia. The infamous Goethe Oak stood in the camp, where hangings occurred beneath a tree, symbolizing German culture. Prisoners worked in quarries and armament factories under brutal conditions, with beatings and executions for failing to meet quotas. When US forces liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, they found emaciated survivors weighing under 80 pounds alongside piles of corpses. Survivor Jorge Semprún wrote of the living death where identity was erased, making prisoners shadows of themselves. The prolonged cycle of suffering, where death was delayed but ever present, made survival feel like extended punishment. Beyond the forest of atrocities stands the camp that established the template for Nazi terror. Dachau. Dachau opened on March 22, 1933, as the first Nazi concentration camp, serving as a blueprint for the entire camp system. Over 200,000 prisoners were registered there, with at least 41,500 deaths, though likely higher due to unrecorded executions. What made Dachau worse than death was its role as a prototype for Nazi terror. Under Theodor Eicker's Dachau model, the camp emphasized discipline, terror, and control through systematic brutality. Prisoners received starvation rations and worked grueling hours in quarries, factories, or construction, with the SS employing extermination through labor. Dachau was a hub for Nazi medical experiments, including high-altitude tests, malaria infections, and hypothermia studies. Dr. Sigmund Rascher's experiments subjected prisoners to freezing water for hours, causing excruciating pain and often death. The camp used torture methods like flogging, tree hanging, suspending prisoners by arms tied behind backs, and confinement in tiny standing cells. By 1945, Dachau was severely overcrowded, with up to 1,600 prisoners crammed into barracks designed for 200. The combination of starvation, disease, brutal labor, psychological terror, and medical torture created an environment where prisoners faced daily choices between enduring torment or succumbing to despair, making survival feel cursed rather than blessed. From the original prototype, we moved to remote quarries where granite became synonymous with death. Flossenbürg. Flossenbürg was established in May 1938 in Bavaria's Fichtel Mountains to exploit granite deposits for Nazi architectural projects. Approximately 89,964 to 100,000 prisoners passed through, with around 30,000 deaths from malnutrition, overwork, executions, and death marches. The granite quarries subjected prisoners to relentless brutality through Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts blasting granite, pushing heavy trolley wagons, and hauling rocks without safety precautions in freezing temperatures with minimal clothing. The backbreaking labor, combined with severe malnutrition, led to frequent accidents and deaths. By 1943, the camp shifted focus to Messerschmitt aircraft production, with over 5,000 prisoners working on Bf-109 fighter plane parts. While armaments work was less physically grueling than quarry labor, conditions remained dire with long hours and brutal oversight. The camp was classified as Grade 3 for incorrigible enemies of the Reich, with designation Return Not Desired, meaning prisoners weren't expected to survive. As Allied forces approached in April 1945, SS evacuated 22,000 prisoners on death marches toward Dachau, with over 7,000 dying from exhaustion, starvation, or execution. The relentless physical destruction combined with complete hopelessness made survival feel like prolonged punishment worse than death. Leaving the granite behind, we encounter industrial killing disguised as brick production. Neuengamme. Neuengamme operated from December 1938 to May 1945 near Hamburg, Germany, established to exploit a defunct brick factory. Over 106,000 prisoners passed through its network of 85 subcamps, with 42,900 verified deaths, though estimates suggest up to 56,000 perished. What made Neuengamme worse than death were the death commandos, 3 particularly deadly work assignments in the brickworks. Prisoners excavated heavy, peaty soil with inadequate tools regardless of weather, working 10 to 12 hours daily with minimal food, clothing, or shelter. The clay pits were especially notorious, with prisoners hauling silt from barges or spreading it with wheelbarrows, often collapsing from fatigue or beatings. Survivor Ewald Gonzik described prisoners carrying back 20-30 sick or dead daily, particularly in bad weather. A typhus epidemic in December 1941 killed over 1,000 prisoners, with death rates escalating to nearly 2,500 in February 1945 alone. During evacuation in April 1945, over 9,000 prisoners were loaded onto ships like the Cap Arcona and Thielbeck, which were bombed by the RAF on May 3, 1945, killing around 7,000 prisoners in a tragic intelligence failure. The combination of brutal labor, starvation, disease, and the horrific mass drowning made survival feel like enduring multiple deaths. From brickworks of doom, we enter a camp where starvation itself became the primary weapon. Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen operated from 1940 to 1945 near Celle, Germany, transitioning from a POW camp to a concentration camp by 1943. When British forces liberated it on April 15, 1945, they found around 60,000 prisoners, with estimates of 50,000, 70,000 total deaths from starvation, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases. What made Bergen-Belsen the starvation camp was its systematic use of hunger as a weapon. Prisoners received as little as 200-300 calories daily in late 1944 and early 1945, compared to the 2,000 calories needed for basic survival. By early 1945, barracks meant for 100 people housed up to 1,000, with no space to lie down. Unlike extermination camps with swift gas chambers, Bergen-Belsen inflicted slow death through neglect. A typhus epidemic in early 1945 killed an estimated 17,000 people, including Anne Frank and her sister Margot, in March 1945. Overcrowded barracks lacked sanitation, with open latrines spreading disease among lice-infested prisoners clothed in rags. When British liberators arrived, they described a vision of hell with thousands of skeletal figures and corpses stacked like firewood. The prolonged agony of starvation, where prisoners ate grass or garbage scraps only to face dysentery, created suffering that transcended death. Many felt death would have been a mercy, compared to watching loved ones waste away while powerless to help, making survival itself a form of torture. Beyond starvation camps lay a place where deception masked the machinery of death. Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt operated from 1941 to 1945 in occupied Czechoslovakia as a Nazi propaganda tool, presented as a model Jewish settlement, while serving as a transit point to extermination camps. Of approximately 144,000 prisoners sent there, 88,000 were deported to death camps, and 33,000 died within Theresienstadt from starvation, disease, and neglect. What made Theresienstadt worse than death was its cruel deception. The Nazis allowed cultural activities like the children's opera Brundibar and staged beautification campaigns for Red Cross visits, creating false hope while planning deportations. The 1944 Nazi propaganda film The Führer Gives a City to the Jews depicted it as a thriving community while prisoners faced starvation and disease. The camp was overcrowded with up to 60,000 people crammed into space meant for 7,000. Elderly Jews were deceived into believing it was a retirement home, signing over property for supposed comfortable lives, only to face neglect and death. Transport lists created constant terror, with prisoners never knowing when they'd be sent east to almost certain death. The psychological torture of false hope, followed by betrayal, combined with watching loved ones disappear on transports, created anguish that survivors described as more devastating than immediate death. From elaborate deceptions, we move to occupied territories where proximity to civilization amplified the horror. Vught. Vught operated from January 1943 to September 1944 in the Netherlands as the only SS-run concentration camp outside Nazi Germany and annexed territories. Approximately 32,000 prisoners were held there, with 749 to 1,000 deaths within the camp and many others deported to extermination camps. What made Vught worse than death was the infamous bunker tragedy of January 15, 1944. 74 women protesting a fellow prisoner's internment were crammed into a 9-square-meter cell without ventilation for over 14 hours. When opened the next morning, 10 women had suffocated and others were severely traumatized. On June 5-6, 1943, nearly 1,300 Jewish children, some infants, were deported with parents to Sobibor, where almost all were murdered upon arrival. The constant deportations created an atmosphere of dread, with prisoners knowing loved ones faced death in the east. Political prisoners and resistance fighters faced systematic beatings, with 329 men shot following Hitler's order to execute suspected saboteurs without trial. The combination of suffocating brutality, family separations, and betrayal by Dutch collaborators made survival feel like prolonged punishment, where death seemed preferable to endless suffering and loss. From Dutch nightmares, we encounter camps that served as gateways to certain death. Westerbork. Westerbork operated from 1942 to 1945 in the Netherlands as a transit camp processing Jews, Roma, Sinti, and resistance fighters for deportation to extermination camps. Of approximately 100,000 prisoners, over 97,000 were deported, with only about 5,000 surviving the war. What made Westerbork the gateway to death was its deceptive facade of normalcy, masking systematic murder. The camp had amenities like hospitals, schools, and cultural activities, including cabaret performances, giving giving false hope while preparing weekly deportation lists. From July 1942 to September 1944, 54,930 people were sent to Auschwitz and 34,313 to Sobibor, with survival rates of only 5% and virtually zero, respectively. Prisoners lived in constant uncertainty, with families torn apart as deportation lists were posted weekly. Many arrived believing they were being resettled for labor, only to face industrialized murder within days or weeks. Notable deportees like Anne Frank and her family passed through in 1944 before being sent to Auschwitz. The psychological torture of false hope, combined with near-certain death, made the waiting itself a form of suffering worse than immediate execution. Dutch Jewish writer Etty Hillesum documented the oppressive atmosphere and looming threat, where survival meant enduring the knowledge that deportation to death was inevitable. Moving beyond transit camps, we venture into the Balkans, where killing grounds operated in plain sight. Sajmište. Sajmište operated from September 1941 to July 1944 near Belgrade, Serbia, becoming a key site of Holocaust and genocide in the Balkans. Of approximately 40,000 prisoners, 20,000 to 23,000 perished through systematic extermination, starvation, and disease. What made Sajmište worse than death was its use of mobile gas vans for mass murder. From December 1941 to May 1942, approximately 6,220, 7,000 Jewish women, children, and elderly inmates were killed in a gas van. Exhaust fumes were diverted into a sealed compartment, causing slow, agonizing deaths lasting 15 to 20 minutes as the van drove through Belgrade to mass graves. The camp was established in former Belgrade fairground pavilions, never designed for human habitation. During the harsh winter of 1941-42, many prisoners froze to death or succumbed to disease due to inadequate shelter. Food rations were grossly inadequate, with survivors reporting eating grass or dirt in desperation. Mass shootings targeted Jewish men in summer and fall 1941, with approximately 5,000 to 8,000 executed at sites like Jajinci. The systematic targeting of entire families, use of claustrophobic gas vans, and freezing conditions created multi-layered suffering where victims faced prolonged agony before death, making survival feel like enduring multiple tortures simultaneously. From the Balkan killing fields, we travel to the harsh Baltic states where environmental brutality met systematic murder. Varvara. Varvara operated from August 1943 to February 1944 in occupied Estonia as the largest of 22 concentration camps in the region. Approximately 20,000 prisoners, mostly Jews from Vilna and Kovno ghettos, passed through with an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 deaths from executions, disease, starvation, and brutal labor. What made Varvara worse than death were the harsh Baltic conditions combined with systematic cruelty. A typhoid epidemic in December 1943 killed approximately 20% of the camp's population, with inadequate medical care and sanitation exacerbating disease spread. Prisoners lived in dilapidated wooden barracks with poor heating during bitter winters. Daily rations consisted of only 200 grams of bread with margarine, ersatz coffee, and watery soup, causing widespread malnutrition. Forced labor included constructing railways, digging anti-tank ditches, and felling trees in half-frozen swamps from morning to night under harsh weather with inadequate clothing. Regular selectionen targeted sick, weak, elderly, and children, with 150 Jews executed after the first selection and 300 killed during typhoid outbreak. The 10% selection in July 1944 saw 1 in 10 prisoners arbitrarily chosen and shot. As Soviets approached, death marches in brutal winter conditions were accompanied by air attacks. The combination of environmental harshness, starvation, disease, and arbitrary executions made survival an endurance test where death often seemed merciful compared to prolonged suffering. Thanks for watching. If you found this video shocking and thrilling, be sure to check out other similar and amazing videos on the screen. I'll see you in the next video.